The steel clicked around her wrists at 2:17 in the afternoon, and Sergeant Dale Pruitt thought he was doing the world a favor. He had 3 officers behind him, a gas station full of witnesses, and a woman he had already decided was nobody. She was wearing faded jeans and a plain medical jacket with a smear of someone else's blood on the left sleeve, and she was standing very still against the side of an old Ford pickup like she had been through worse than this before. She had. The sergeant didn't know that yet. He also didn't know about the 4 unmarked federal vehicles sitting at the edge of the highway overpass exactly 1 mile north, or about the agent inside the lead vehicle who had just received a text message that made her stop breathing for 3 full seconds. He didn't know any of it. All he knew was that he had a woman in handcuffs and nobody to stop him. She was the last person he should have touched. If you are watching this for the first time, stay until the end. This video, drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from, and follow along, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The drive from Calverton Memorial Hospital to her mother's house in Dunbar County took Lena Marsh exactly 2 hours and 40 minutes on a good day, and this was supposed to be a good day. She had clocked out of a 12-hour shift at 7 in the morning, changed out of her scrubs in the hospital locker room, pulled on her jeans and the old medical jacket she kept in her bag out of habit, and walked to the parking structure where her brother was already waiting in the truck with the engine running and a gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder. "You look terrible," her brother said when she climbed in. "Thank you, Patrick," she said. "You look underdressed for a federal courthouse." Patrick Marsh was 34 years old and had been a federal circuit judge for the last 2 years, though you would never know it from looking at him on a Saturday afternoon. He was wearing dark jeans, a gray fleece, and the kind of unremarkable sneakers that were designed specifically to attract zero attention. That was intentional. He had been handling a sensitive case for the last several months, and his security detail had recommended a low profile whenever he traveled outside the city. No suit, no courthouse ID visible, no official vehicle. Just a man who looked like any other ordinary person, riding in his sister's old truck. Lena was 30 years old. She worked emergency trauma at Calverton Memorial, where she had been for the last 3 years, and before that she had spent 6 years as a U.S. Army combat medic attached to rapid response evacuation units in high-risk deployment zones. She had treated shrapnel wounds in tents with no electricity. She had performed field surgeries by flashlight. She had talked men and women through the worst moments of their lives, under conditions that would have broken most people in half, and she had come home from all of it steady, quiet, and deeply allergic to unnecessary conflict. She was not the kind of person who looked for trouble. She was also not the kind of person who didn't recognize it when it found her. The gas station outside Bellow Creek, Georgia, was called Merritt's Fuel and Supply, and it sat at the intersection of Route 9 and an unmarked county road with a hand-painted sign advertising boiled peanuts and cold bait, kind of place that existed because nothing else was nearby. The parking lot was cracked asphalt patched with gravel, and the single working pump had a laminated notice taped to it, warning that the card reader was broken, and all purchases had to go inside. Patrick pulled the truck up to the pump at 1:46 in the afternoon, and Lena went inside to pay cash. The man behind the counter was named Gary Odell. He was somewhere in his 50s, with a sun-damaged neck, and a flat affect that suggested he had either seen everything or cared about nothing. He took her cash without making eye contact. She bought 2 bottles of water, a pack of beef jerky, and paid for $20 of regular. He gave her change with the mechanical efficiency of someone running low on patience for the day. She went back outside, helped Patrick figure out the pump, and leaned against the passenger side of the truck while the fuel ran. That was when the cruiser pulled in. It wasn't unusual. Rural gas stations attracted law enforcement the same way they attracted everyone else who needed fuel, and Lena didn't give it a second look when the first cruiser swung into the lot. She was watching her phone, checking a message from a colleague about a patient follow-up, and she didn't look up until she heard the door slam harder than it needed to. Sergeant Dale Pruitt was a large man, the kind of large that comes from authority long unquestioned rather than from effort. He wore his uniform the way some men wore a costume, with the particular certainty of someone who had never once had to justify himself. He stepped out of his cruiser and immediately scanned the parking lot with the slow, deliberate assessment of someone looking for something he could use, and his eyes landed on the old Ford truck with the cracked taillight and the woman leaning against it in a medical jacket. 2 more officers came out of a second cruiser that pulled in behind the first. Officer Marcus Webb, who was younger, maybe 25, and already wearing the same easy contempt as his sergeant. And Officer Dana Croft, who hung back slightly, not entirely comfortable. not entirely willing to say so. Pruitt walked toward the truck. Lena put her phone away. Whose vehicle is this? Pruitt said, not asked, said. The way you say something when you've already decided, the answer doesn't matter. Mine, Lena said. Pruitt looked at the truck the way some people look at a person they've already dismissed. Registration current? Yes. Insurance? Yes. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has made a decision and is now inventing the rationale. Mind if we take a look inside? Lena kept her voice level. I do mind, actually. Was there something specific that raised a concern? Patrick had come around from the pump side and was standing just behind her now. He said nothing. He had learned years ago that Lena handled herself better without interference, and he was watching Pruitt with the careful attention of someone filing information away. Pruitt looked at Patrick and then back at Lena. Got a report of suspicious activity from inside the store, he said. Lena didn't move. From who? That's not your concern. It is if you're planning to use it as grounds for a search. Webb made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Pruitt's jaw tightened. Where are you two coming from, he said. Calverton, Lena said. What for? I live here. I'm visiting my mother. Pruitt tilted his head. You work at that hospital up in Calverton? Emergency department. He looked at the blood stain on her sleeve. Your blood? No. Whose is it? A patient's. I worked a 12-hour trauma shift this morning, Sergeant. I didn't have time to change jackets before I left. He stared at her for a long moment. Lena stared back. Not aggressively. Just clearly the way someone stares when they have nothing to hide, and they want you to understand that. Step away from the vehicle, Pruitt said. Why? Step away from the vehicle, ma'am. Lena stepped away from the vehicle. She moved with deliberate calm, keeping her hands visible, her posture neutral. She had learned early in her army training that the fastest way to escalate a tense situation was to match aggression with aggression. She had also learned that the fastest way to document an abuse of power was to remain the most composed person in the vicinity. Webb moved toward the truck. Lena turned her head to watch him. He needs a warrant to search the vehicle, she said. Pruitt stepped closer to her. You got a law degree in that nursing school, did you? I know my rights, she said. You don't need a law degree for that. Webb was already pulling open the passenger door. You need to stop, Lena said, her voice still flat and even. That is an unlawful search. I did not give consent. Pruitt moved into her space. He was close enough now that she could smell the coffee on his breath, and she didn't step back. She held her ground with the stillness of someone who had once maintained composure while a mortar round hit 40 meters from her position. You're going to want to lower your voice, Pruitt said. I'm going to want to lower my voice, Lena repeated. And something in her tone made Webb stop for just a second because there was nothing frightened in it. Nothing at all. I'm standing in a parking lot speaking at a normal volume while you conduct an unauthorized search of my vehicle. You might want to consider how this looks. How what looks? This. She didn't gesture, she didn't have to. Across the pump island, a woman in a yellow jacket had her phone up. She'd been there since before the cruisers arrived, sitting on the hood of her sedan with a soda, and now she was recording. Her name was Darcy Fowler, and she had been filming since Pruitt walked toward the truck. Pruitt noticed the phone. His expression didn't change, but his jaw did, barely perceptibly, a tightening that told Lena he'd registered it and decided not to care. Webb pulled Patrick's leather document folio out from behind the passenger seat and dropped it on the hood of the truck. Papers slid out across the metal. Patrick made a single sound under his breath that Lena recognized. He was an extremely controlled person by professional training, but he had a tell. This short exhale through his nose, when something moved into territory that would have consequences. She heard it now and kept her eyes on Pruitt. Those are legal documents, she said. If those get damaged, then you shouldn't have brought them somewhere suspicious, Pruitt said. Sir, Lena kept her voice at the exact same measured level. I would like you to explain. Specifically, what behavior triggered the report from inside the store, what lawful basis you have for this search, and your badge number. Pruitt looked at her. You done? I'm waiting for an answer, sir. He grabbed her arm. It happened fast enough that it startled everyone, including Webb. Pruitt gripped her upper arm and turned her toward the truck. One motion, practiced and efficient. Lena did not fight it. She turned, placed her palms flat against the truck hood, and felt the cold metal under her fingers. You're interfering with a lawful investigation, Pruitt said behind her. What is the lawful investigation, she said. Suspicion of transport of stolen property. Based on what? He didn't answer. She heard the cuffs come off his belt. Patrick stepped forward. Sergeant, sir, you need to step back. It is my sister, and she has not committed any. Step back or you'll be joining her. Patrick stopped. He looked at Lena. She turned her head and met his eyes and gave him one small shake of hers. Don't. He understood. He stopped. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists at 2:17 in the afternoon, and Dale Pruitt stood back and looked satisfied. Lena stood at the hood of the truck with her wrists locked behind her and looked out across the parking lot at the woman in the yellow jacket, with her phone raised and thought, with the remote, operational calm that had been trained into her one deployment at a time, that this was going to matter. Not in the way Pruitt assumed things mattered. In the other way. The permanent way. "You really should have asked more questions," she said. Pruitt made a dismissive sound and walked back to his cruiser. Inside the store, Gary Odell watched through the smudged window and felt something uncomfortable sitting in his chest that he couldn't quite name. He'd made the call when Pruitt had come in earlier, before Lena had even arrived. When the sergeant had stopped in for coffee and leaned on the counter and said, in a voice that wasn't quite a request, that if any particular kind of people came through today and seemed like they were worth looking at, Gary should call it in. Gary had taken a long moment with that. He had a lease that was overdue, and a county business license that came up for renewal in 6 weeks, and Pruitt's cousin sat on the county business board. So Gary had called it in. Now he was watching through the window, and the uncomfortable thing in his chest was getting harder to name. Lena had been in the Army for 6 years, and the thing about 6 years in an active combat medicine role that people outside that world didn't understand was that it didn't just teach you how to treat injuries, it taught you how to read situations. You learned to assess threat before threat became explicit. You learned to identify the staging of a scene the way a builder identifies the framing of a structure, by looking at what's underneath the surface rather than at the surface itself. Standing against the side of her truck with her wrists behind her back, Lena was reading. The report from inside the store had been called in before the officers arrived. She knew that because Pruitt had come in already oriented toward them, already looking at the truck, before he'd gotten a description of anything from the cashier. The cruisers had come from the south, from the direction of Bellow Creek proper, which meant they'd been rolling before the call came in, or the call had been made well in advance of their arrival. Neither option was accidental. Pruitt wasn't working from an anonymous tip. He was working from something else. Something that had been set up. She had seen this pattern before, not in Georgia, but in another context entirely. It was a mechanism she recognized from the kind of intelligence briefings that came through military criminal investigation channels when she had been assigned to a unit dealing with an internal conduct complaint. Create a situation. You trigger an interaction. You use the interaction as a pressure point. The question was what she was supposed to be a pressure point for. The obvious answer was Patrick. Her brother was a federal judge in the middle of a case that certain people would prefer to go differently. He was traveling without his security detail, without his official credentials visible, without any of the institutional armor that would otherwise make him difficult to touch. If someone wanted to create a complicating event for Patrick Marsh, creating a documented incident involving his sister in a jurisdiction where they had cooperative law enforcement would be a straightforward way to do it. She filed this hypothesis and continued reading. Webb was still going through the truck cab, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who didn't expect to be stopped. He'd found the medical kit she kept behind the seat, the large ballistic nylon bag she'd carried since her deployment days, stocked with trauma supplies she still kept current out of habit. He lifted it out and set it on the hood of the truck. "What's all this?" he said, not to her specifically. "Medical supplies," she said. "You always travel with this much gear? I'm an emergency trauma nurse. I've been carrying a trauma kit since I was 22 years old." He unzipped it. Tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, a blood pressure cuff, a surgical airway kit, a sealed package of surgical instruments. He looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her with an expression that was trying to be skeptical, but was lancing somewhere closer to confused. Pruitt came back around and looked at the bag. "Where'd you get all this?" he said. "The hospital and the Army," Lena said, in that order. Pruitt picked up the surgical instrument package. "Army? I was a combat medic for 6 years. I have the discharge papers in my glove compartment if you need to see them, assuming Officer Webb hasn't scattered them across the parking lot with everything else." Pruitt set the package down. He was looking at her differently now, the way people look when they've made an assumption that's starting to become inconvenient. "You served," he said. "Yes." "In what?" "Rapid response evacuation." 2 tours, she paused. "You want my unit designation, or is the general concept sufficient?" He didn't respond to that. He turned to Webb and said something low, and Webb started putting things back, less carefully than he'd taken them out. "Still being detained on suspicion of transport of stolen property," Pruitt said. "We'll sort this out at the station." "You found no stolen property," Lena said. "That's not the basis of the hold." "Then what is?" Your attitude during the encounter. She looked at him for a long moment. My attitude, she repeated. You're going to write up a detention log that says the grounds were my attitude. Obstruction of what? The unlawful search of my vehicle that produced nothing? You're not helping yourself, he said. Neither are you, she said quietly. Patrick had been standing very still near the pump, watching everything. He had his phone in his hand and had been photographing the scene with the careful method of someone who understood the evidentiary value of documentation. When Pruitt turned toward him, Patrick put the phone in his pocket without rushing. You her brother? Pruitt said. Yes, Patrick said. What do you do? Patrick looked at him with an expression that was entirely neutral. I'm in law, he said. Lawyer, not exactly, Patrick said. Pruitt lost interest. People in law were a complication, but not an insurmountable one. He looked at his watch and then back at Lena and said they'd be transporting her to the Bellow Creek substation for processing. On what charge, she said. Obstruction and resisting. I didn't resist. My officers have a different account. Lena absorbed this. She was thinking clearly, in the specific way she had been trained to think clearly when everything around her was designed to produce panic. Panic was the enemy of evidence. Panic made you say things you couldn't take back, make movements that could be described as threatening, produce a record that served someone else's narrative. She breathed. She noted the time. She noted the license plates on both cruisers, which she'd committed to memory 2 minutes after they arrived. She noted the name on Webb's badge. She noted that Officer Croft, the third officer, hadn't touched the vehicle and hadn't spoken, and was standing 20 feet away, with her arms crossed and her eyes on the pavement. She noted Darcy Fowler, still recording from across the pump island, the yellow jacket bright in the afternoon light. She noted that Gary Odell had come to the window. She noted all of it, the way she had once noted the terrain of an evac corridor before running it, because situational awareness was not a thing you turned on and off. It was a thing you maintained. And right now, the most important thing she was aware of was something Pruitt had no idea about. The conversation she'd had 3 weeks ago, in a parking structure in Atlanta, with a woman named SSA Reese Ingram, who worked for the FBI's Civil Rights Division and had a file on Dale Pruitt that was 47 pages long. The recording was already on the internet. Darcy Fowler had a following of some kind on social media, something Lena wouldn't have known and didn't need to know. But it was relevant because within 40 minutes of the handcuffs going on, the video had been shared beyond the local reach of Bellow Creek, Georgia. It had captions, it had context. It had the audio of Pruitt saying your attitude during the encounter as grounds for detention, and it had Lena's voice, level and clear, saying that is an unlawful search. I did not give consent. It also had Pruitt's expression when he'd first grabbed her arm. That expression was the kind of thing that didn't require explanation. It was legible across context and culture, and any variation of the question, who is this person, and why does she have to stay calm? The answer was visible in her posture, in the absolute stillness of her hands, in the fact that she had not flinched when he grabbed her, even though she could have made things very complicated for him in that single moment. She hadn't, because she was thinking clearly, and clearly meant long-term. Back inside the Merritt's Fuel and Supply, Gary Odell had stopped watching through the window and was now behind the counter, with his hand pressed flat against the laminate, staring at nothing. His phone was on the counter, beside the register. He'd gotten 3 text messages in the last 20 minutes from a number he didn't recognize, asking if the contact had been made, if the sergeant had responded, and most recently, just a question mark. He wasn't answering any of them. He picked up his phone, looked at the texts, looked at the window where the parking lot was visible, and then set the phone face down. The Bellow Creek substation. Lena was processed with the particular efficiency of a department that ran this kind of intake regularly enough to have the rhythm of it down to a routine. She was photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding room with a metal chair and a table bolted to the floor, still in her medical jacket. They left her alone. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She thought. The substation was 12 miles from the Merritt's gas station and 18 miles from the Bellow Creek Municipal Center, which put it in an awkward jurisdictional position relative to both the county sheriff's office and state police post on Route 9. This was probably intentional in the original design of the facility, the kind of administrative geography that created useful ambiguity about which oversight body was technically responsible for what. She was familiar with useful ambiguity. The Army had a version of it. So did the federal government. What she also knew was that useful ambiguity had limits, and those limits were defined by whether the people operating inside the ambiguity had been careful enough to stay outside documented view. Pruitt had not been careful. He'd been confident, which was different. She thought about the call to SSA Ingram she hadn't been able to make because her phone was in her bag, which was currently logged as personal property in the intake system. She thought about Patrick, who was not in custody, who had his phone, who was at this exact moment either calling a lawyer or calling someone considerably more consequential than a lawyer. She thought he was probably calling someone more consequential. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Ingram 3 weeks ago, which had started as a routine contact for her role as an informal witness in the civil rights investigation, and had ended with Ingram saying something that she'd filed carefully in the back of her mind. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you think the department is creating pressure specifically targeting you or anyone close to you, don't escalate it, document it, and contact us immediately. Lena had not escalated it. She had documented everything she could while in direct view of her phone. And she was now sitting in a holding room of the very department under investigation, having been put here by the subject of that investigation. The irony of this was so thorough that she almost wanted to describe it to someone. There was a camera mounted in the upper corner of the room, and she looked at it directly, just for a moment, not challenging it, just acknowledging it. She wanted the footage to show someone sitting calmly in a metal chair, with their hands folded on a table. She wanted it to show the exact opposite of a person who had done anything wrong. She looked away from the camera. She thought about Patrick's face when Pruitt had put the cuffs on her, the controlled stillness of it, and the small nod he'd given her when she'd looked at him. That nod meant he was handling it. Patrick Marsh had been a litigator before he'd gone to the bench, and before that he'd been the kind of law student who spent his summers working public defender cases in rural Georgia counties, and he understood jurisdictional geography and institutional accountability better than most people understood their own hometowns. He was handling it. She breathed. She ran through her training in her head, not frantically, but methodically, the way she ran through medical protocols when she was waiting for a patient to stabilize. What do you know? What don't you know? What can you control? What can't you? What's the next step? What she knew, she was being held on fabricated grounds by officers whose department was already under federal investigation. What she didn't know, whether the people orchestrating this had any idea about her connection to that investigation. What she could control, her own behavior, her own composure, the narrative that her conduct would create when the records were reviewed. What she couldn't control the next 48 hours. Next step, wait. She was good at waiting. She had once waited in a forward operating position for 11 hours for an evac window that everyone said wasn't coming, and it had come, and she had been ready. This was different, but the patience was the same kind. She sat in the metal chair in the holding room of the Bellow Creek substation, with her hands folded on the bolted-down table, and she did not look afraid, because she wasn't, and she did not look angry, because anger would cost her, and she did not look like someone who didn't know exactly what kind of situation she was in. She knew precisely what kind of situation she was in. She was the woman at the center of a mechanism designed to create pressure on her brother's judicial proceeding, sitting in a room inside the department of the man who'd triggered it, with a federal investigation running one level above all of them, and absolutely nobody in the building she was sitting in knew the last part yet. She pressed her palms flat on the table and waited. 12 miles north at a rest area off Route 9, a black SUV with federal plates was parked at the far end of the lot with its engine running. Inside's SSA Reese Ingram was reading a text message from a number she recognized, and her expression had gone very still in the way that faces go still when something that was predicted has just arrived ahead of schedule. She looked at the message for 3 seconds. Then she looked up at her partner in the driver's seat. "Get the team," she said. He was already putting the car in drive. Reese Ingram had been doing this work for 11 years, and she had learned early that the cases that moved fast were usually the cases that had been building slowly for a very long time. The Pruitt file had been building for 2 years, 4 months, and approximately 16 days, depending on how you counted the origin point, whether you started from the first formal complaint filed by a Bellow Creek resident named Aldous Perrin, or from the internal affairs memo that had been quietly buried by the department's own review board 6 months before that. She counted from the buried memo. The drive from the rest area to the Bellow Creek substation took 14 minutes at highway speed, with no lights and no sirens, because she wanted no advance warning. She had 2 additional agents in the SUV with her, her partner Damon Reyes, who drove with the specific competence of someone who had done protective deterrent work before transferring to civil rights, and a junior agent named Colette Strand, who was on her second major field action and was managing her nerves by keeping her eyes forward and her mouth shut. Good instinct. Ingram had noted it. She also had on her phone the video. She had watched it twice in the parking lot before they left. Darcy Fowler's footage was 41 seconds of the most unambiguous documentation of unprovoked escalation she had seen in a field action in 4 years of civil rights work. And that was saying something, because she had seen a lot. The audio was clear. Lena's voice was calm. Pruitt's hands were visible. The moment the cuffs went on was frame perfect, caught from an angle that showed both Lena's compliance and Pruitt's decision to escalate without cause. She had forwarded the link to her supervisor in Atlanta and then put her phone in her jacket pocket and told Reyes to drive. The problem she was working through as they moved down Route 9 was not the evidence. The evidence was, at this juncture, almost embarrassingly thorough. The problem was the mechanism behind it, the part that went deeper than Pruitt, grabbing a woman in a parking lot because he felt like it. Because Dale Pruitt was not an independent actor. He was a consistent one, which was a different thing. He did what he did because something larger made doing it feel safe, and that something larger was what Ingram had been trying to document for 2 years, and it had a shape now, a specific institutional shape, and the woman currently sitting in Pruitt's holding room was connected to it in a way that was either a coincidence or wasn't, and Reese Ingram did not, professionally or temperamentally, believe in coincidences of this particular variety. She called her supervisor from the car. "Lena Marsh is in Bellow Creek substation," she said without preamble. Pruitt detained her on fabricated grounds at Merritt's on Route 9. Her brother Patrick Marsh was present and is currently undetained. There was a silence that contained a lot of information. Patrick Marsh, the federal judge. Yes, another silence. Who else knows? The footage is already public. I've seen it shared at least 3 times in the last 20 minutes. How bad is the footage? It's clean, crystal clear audio, good angle, total lack of ambiguity. All right. Her supervisor exhaled. "You have the authority to proceed. Don't let this get messy on the back end. Understood." She hung up. Reyes glanced at her from the driver's seat. He had the kind of face that asked questions without moving. "We go in straight," she said. "No drama. I want Pruitt to understand what's happening before he has time to start calling anyone." "What about the judge?" "Patrick Marsh knows where we're going. He's meeting us there." She looked out the windshield at the flat Georgia highway. "He's been very patient." Patrick had not felt patient. He had felt the specific, contained fury of someone who understood exactly what was being done and exactly why, and who had spent the last hour and a half being meticulously, deliberately, carefully furious. Because the alternative was to do something visible, and that would serve nobody, least of all Lena. He had made 3 calls from the parking lot of the Merritt station after the transport vehicle took his sister away. The first was to a federal public defender he trusted who operated out of Atlanta and had experience with rural Georgia department conduct. The second was to the federal courthouse in Decatur, where he had a contact who could begin the paperwork process for a civil rights complaint before the substation even finished processing Lena's intake. The third was to a number he had for SSA Ingram, which Lena had given him 3 weeks ago, with the instruction that he should only use it if something happened that seemed connected to the investigation. Something had happened. He didn't drive to the substation immediately. He sat in the parking lot of the gas station for 40 minutes, photographed the ground where Pruitt had conducted the search, photographed the truck, documented the scattered papers, got a signed statement from Darcy Fowler, who had stopped recording and was now pale and shaking slightly from the adrenaline of having watched the whole thing, and spoke briefly to a second witness, an older man named Ray Tesaro, who had been filling his tank during the confrontation and had seen Pruitt arrive before anyone had called anything in. That last detail mattered. Ray Tesaro had pulled in before the first cruiser and had watched Pruitt enter the store, speak to the cashier, and come back out. Call that Pruitt claimed triggered the stop had allegedly been made, while Lena was already at the pump. But Ray Tesaro said Pruitt had come out of the store already moving toward the truck before Lena had finished pumping fuel. The sequence was wrong. Patrick wrote it down, took Ray Tesaro's contact information, and thanked him. Then he got in the truck and drove toward Bellow Creek. He was not afraid. He was the kind of angry that had calcified into something operational, something that moved through him like a cold current, and he drove the 12 miles to the substation with his hands at 10 and 2 and his mind building the structure of what came next. He arrived in the substation parking lot 11 minutes before Ingram's SUV did. He sat in the truck and waited. When the black SUV pulled in, he got out. Inside, Lena had been alone in the holding room for an hour and 19 minutes when the door opened and a different officer came in. Not Pruitt, not Webb. A duty officer she hadn't seen before, somewhere in his 30s, with the look of someone who processed paperwork and preferred it that way. He set a paper cup of water on the table and didn't say anything. Thank you, she said. He nodded and left. She drank the water. It tasted like it had come through old pipes. She set the cup down and returned to her hands-folded position and continued waiting. She was aware that she was tired. The 12-hour shift was sitting in her body the way long shifts always did, not as exhaustion exactly, but as a kind of accumulated weight, a slight heaviness in her shoulders and behind her eyes. She'd had maybe 5 hours of sleep the night before, and the 2 cups of coffee she'd had that morning were long metabolized. She noted the fatigue without giving it authority over anything and kept thinking. The thing she kept returning to was Gary Odell. The cashier had been scared, she was almost certain. Not the scared of someone who had done something spontaneously, but the scared of someone who had done something under pressure and was now watching it become larger than they'd planned for. She'd seen that expression before. In the army, you occasionally ran into civilian contractors who'd made arrangements with the wrong people and were now watching the consequences of those arrangements approach them from a distance. The expression had a specific quality, not guilt, exactly, more like dread. The understanding that the thing you did is still moving, and you can no longer steer it. Gary Odell had that expression. She filed it. She was still thinking about it when she heard voices in the corridor, and then the voices got sharper, and one of them she recognized as Pruitt even through the door, and another one she didn't, a woman's voice. And the woman's voice was calm in the specific way that authority is calm when it is not asking for permission. The door opened. Pruitt came in first. His face had changed, she noticed immediately. Particular confidence was gone, replaced by something tighter, something bracing. Behind him, SSA Reese Ingram walked in and looked at Lena the way someone looks at a person they've been worried about for the last 90 minutes. You okay? Ingram said. Fine, Lena said. Good. Ingram turned to Pruitt. Keys. Pruitt's jaw worked. Agent Ingram, this is a local law enforcement matter involving. Keys to the restraints, Ingram said, still calm. She's not restrained right now, because I can see her hands. But if she were, those keys would be the first thing you handed me. Do we need to have a longer conversation about the authority structure here? Or can we move forward? Pruitt handed over a small key from his belt. She's not in restraints, he said. I know. I'm establishing the dynamic. Ingram set the key on the table without using it. Sit down, Sergeant. Pruitt didn't sit. He stood near the door with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who was recalculating, rapidly, how much trouble he was in. Ingram sat down across from Lena. Reyes remained standing near the door. I need to brief you, Ingram said to Lena. Some of what I'm about to say Sergeant Pruitt is going to want to hear. Some of it he really isn't. I'm going to say all of it anyway. Lena said nothing. She waited. Ingram set her credentials on the table, not for Lena's benefit, but for the room's. Supervisory Special Agent Reese Ingram, FBI Civil Rights Division, Atlanta Field Office. Ms. Marsh, you are being released. The grounds for your detention are not supportable and will not produce a charge. Sergeant Pruitt is aware of this. Pruitt said nothing. What I need to tell you, Ingram continued, is that your detention today is now part of a federal record that was already open. You were not selected for this encounter randomly. Someone triggered this interaction deliberately, knowing that you and your brother were traveling on Route 9 today. She paused. Someone knew your route. Lena absorbed this. How? That's what we're working on. Pruitt shifted near the door. Ingram looked at him. Sergeant, you're going to want to stay in this room until Agent Reyes has finished a conversation with your watch commander. I'd recommend not using your phone until that conversation concludes. Pruitt looked at his phone. Then he put it back in his shirt pocket. Am I being charged with something, he said. Not yet, Ingram said. That's a precise answer. The room went quiet. Lena reached across the table and picked up the small key Ingram's had set down, turned it over once in her fingers, and set it back down. She wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe just to do something with her hands. Patrick was in the lobby when they brought Lena out. He had been standing near the front desk with his arms crossed and his expression set to a specific register that Lena had seen exactly twice before in her life. Once, when their father had been in the hospital and the attending physician had been dismissive, and once during a law school moot court competition where an opposing team had made a procedural error and Patrick had seen it 30 seconds before anyone else. It was the expression of controlled precision, of a person who has the advantage and knows it and is waiting for the correct moment to use it. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she said, I'm fine. I know, he said. You look like you've been doing math in your head for an hour. Closer to 90 minutes. She almost smiled. Was it good math? Extremely, he said. Ingram came out behind Lena and extended her hand to Patrick. He shook it. Judge Marsh, she said. I'm out of my jurisdiction, he said. I'm just her brother today. Understood. Ingram looked at both of them. I need about 20 minutes of your time, both of you, and then I'll need you to stay accessible for the next week. Things are going to move quickly. Patrick nodded. Lena looked back toward the corridor where the holding room was, and then forward again. What about Pruitt? He's not going anywhere, Ingram said. Not tonight. They sat in Ingram's SUV in the substation parking lot because there was nowhere better, and Ingram told them what she could tell them, which was more than Lena had expected and slightly less than she'd wanted. The investigation into the Bellow Creek department had begun with a pattern of stops that followed a specific profile, specific enough that a civil rights attorney in Atlanta had identified it and brought a formal complaint to the federal level. Documented stops over 14 months, all involving individuals who had no prior record, no traffic violation, no probable cause, and all resulting in vehicle searches that produced nothing illegal. 5 of the 8 individuals had been connected, however loosely, to businesses or legal proceedings that involved interests affiliated with a county commissioner named Roy Dunbar, who sat on the board that controlled county contracts for infrastructure, commercial licensing, and law enforcement funding. Roy Dunbar had a cousin on the county business licensing board. Gary Odell's lease was 3 months overdue. Patrick, who had been listening with his hands in his lap and his face very still, said, "My case." "Yes," Ingram said. "Which proceeding specifically?" "The Dunbar Holdings infrastructure fraud case. The civil trial, not the criminal." She looked at him. "You've been the assigned judge for 8 months. I'm aware of how long I've been assigned to my own case," he said. "Not sharp. Just precise. The theory," Ingram said carefully, "is that someone connected to Dunbar Holdings wanted leverage. Not necessarily to stop the trial, just to create a complication. Something on record. An incident involving a family member. The kind of thing that creates a recusal argument or at minimum a media complication." Patrick said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "They knew our route." "Yes." "How? We're still working on that." Ingram looked at her hands. "It's possible there's a leak somewhere in your courthouse staff. Possible it was a phone track. We don't know yet." Lena said Gary Odell. Ingram looked at her, the cashier. He was scared before anything happened. He'd already been leaned on. She paused. "He's going to talk if someone asks him the right way." Ingram was quiet for a second. We had the same read. "Are you going to him tonight?" "Strand is there now," Ingram said. "She's good with reluctant witnesses." Lena nodded. Patrick looked out the window at the substation building. The light above the front door was flickering, the kind of intermittent flicker that suggested the bulb had been going for a while, and nobody had bothered to change it. He looked at it for a moment. "What's the timeline?" he said. "We're moving to full action status," Ingram said. "The footage changes the speed of everything. We can't sit on this quietly now that it's public." She paused. "I want to be honest with you. This gets worse before it gets better. There will be a period where Pruitt and whoever is behind him will try to muddy the record. Claim Lena was combative. Claim the stop was procedurally justified. Claim the footage is missing context. It isn't," Lena said. "No, but they'll say it is." Ingram looked at her. "Your military record is going to be relevant. Your conduct in the field, your conduct in the service, your civilian conduct. They're going to look for anything they can use." Lena held her gaze. "They won't find anything, I know," Ingram said. "But the looking is going to happen, and it's going to be uncomfortable." "I've been uncomfortable before," Lena said. Ingram nodded slowly, the nod of someone who believed that. They drove to their mother's house 2 hours late. Helen Marsh was 63 and had been a county school teacher for 27 years, and she had the particular composure of a woman who had raised 2 children largely alone after her husband died when Lena was 9 and Patrick was 12, which was the kind of composure that didn't rattle easily, but also didn't pretend that things were fine when they weren't. She opened the door before they reached it, looked at both of them, and said, "You're late, and you look like something happened." "Something happened," Patrick said. "Is it the kind of something I need to sit down for?" "Probably," Lena said. Helen looked at them both with the particular expression of a woman who had survived enough to know that the assessment of how bad something is matters less than what you do next. She stepped back from the door. "Then come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." The video had by 9 o'clock that evening moved beyond Georgia. Darcy Fowler's footage had been shared and reshared and clipped and re-uploaded to the point where the original was now one of several versions circulating on different platforms, and the audio clarity was the thing that kept driving engagement. You could hear Lena's voice. You could hear the steadiness of it. You could hear the moment Pruitt said the word attitude as grounds for detention and the subsequent silence that followed, the silence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing with that silence, which was letting it sit in the air where everyone who watched the video would eventually also let it sit and decide what it meant. Comments were the kind of comments that videos like this generated. Was to say they were overwhelming and contradictory, and some of them were very angry, and some of them were very afraid, and some of them were from veterans who recognized the particular quality of Lena's stillness and were saying so in plain language. Former combat medic, one comment read, "You can tell by the way she doesn't move. She's reading the whole situation." "Nobody knows who she is yet," said another. "But she knows exactly who she is." Darcy Fowler had, by midnight, been contacted by 4 journalists and 2 television news producers and had given no interviews on the advice of the public defender's office that Patrick had reached from the parking lot of the Merritt station. Inside the Bellow Creek substation, Sergeant Dale Pruitt had been asked to remain available and had spent the last 4 hours in a back office with his phone and a very long mental list of people he wanted to call. He had called 3 of them before Ingram's team had quietly and legally obtained a monitoring order that he wasn't told about. The 3 calls were now part of the federal record. The first call had been to a man named Terry Voss, who was the ranking officer at the substation and Pruitt's direct supervisor. The second call had been to a number registered to a real estate LLC in Augusta that had no obvious connection to anything until you looked at the LLC's registration documents, which listed a director named Martin Dunbar, who was the nephew of County Commissioner Roy Dunbar. The third call had been to Officer Marcus Webb. Ingram had listened to a recording of the third call in her car at 11:15 at night, with a coffee going cold in the cup holder and her notepad open on her knee. The call was short. Pruitt had spoken quickly and used language that was carefully non-specific, the language of someone who knew or suspected that calls could be monitored. But the shape of what he was trying to communicate was not ambiguous. He was telling Webb to say that Lena had been aggressive. He was trying to build a counter-narrative before the morning. Ingram had noted the time of the call, the content, and the fact that Webb had said very little in response, which she also noted, because the absence of enthusiasm from a co-conspirator at the moment of attempted coordination was a data point she'd learned not to ignore. Called Strand. "How's Odell?" she said. "He's been crying for about 20 minutes, Strand said. "I think he's ready." "Don't push him," Ingram said. "Let him get there." "I'm not pushing," Strand said. "I brought him decaf." Gary Odell had never intended for any of this to go as far as it went. That was what he kept saying to Agent Strand, who sat across from him at the small table in the back room of the Merritt's Fuel and Supply with her notepad closed because she had learned that some witnesses talked more freely when they couldn't see you writing things down. Gary kept saying he hadn't known who the woman was. He hadn't known there was a federal judge in the truck. He hadn't known it would end with handcuffs and transport and a video seen by what was already approaching a significant number of people. "What did you know?" Strand said. Gary pressed his hands flat on the table. His hands were large and roughened, and they shook slightly. "I knew Pruitt wanted me to call it in if certain people came through," he said. "He said to describe them as suspicious. He didn't say why." "And you believed him?" "I had the lease and the license renewal and—" Gary stopped. "I told myself it would just be a conversation." A stop. Nothing serious. Strand let the silence sit. "The woman's face," Gary said after a moment. "When I watched through the window, she wasn't scared. She was just watching everything, like she was in a whole other kind of situation than everybody else." He looked at his hands. "That's when I knew I'd done something wrong." Strand waited another few seconds. "Mr. Odell," she said, "I need you to tell me everything about your arrangement with Sergeant Pruitt, starting from the first time he came into your store and said something that felt like more than a request. Do you think you can do that?" Gary looked at her for a long moment. He was 53 years old and had run this gas station for 11 years and had made exactly one decision in that time that he was going to spend a very long time unmaking. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." He started talking. 12 miles away, Lena sat at her mother's kitchen table with a mug of coffee and her hands wrapped around it, listening to Helen tell Patrick about the new gutters she'd had put on the house and the neighbor's dog who kept getting into her garden. The conversation was deliberately ordinary, the kind of ordinary that families generate specifically to cover the time between something terrible and whatever comes next, and Lena let it wash over her and felt the warmth of the mug against her palms and thought about nothing in particular. She thought about nothing for maybe 6 minutes. Then her phone buzzed. Text from Ingram. Short, 3 sentences. "Odell is cooperating. Second phone trace confirmed. The route leak came from inside the courthouse." Lena read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the table and looked at Patrick across the kitchen, and he looked at Patrick across the kitchen. That it was from his expression that his phone had buzzed at the same moment, and he had read the same message. The courthouse. Someone inside Patrick's courthouse had told someone connected to Roy Dunbar exactly which road his car would be on that afternoon and exactly when. Patrick looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. When he looked up, his face was very still. "How many people knew we were traveling today?" Lena said. "4," Patrick said, "including my clerk." Neither of them said anything else. Helen, who had noticed the phones and the silence and the look that passed between her children, and who had been a schoolteacher, long enough to know when something was being decided in a room, set down her coffee cup and folded her hands and said, "Whatever it is, you'll handle it." "We know, Mom," Patrick said. "I'm not saying it to comfort you," Helen said. "I'm saying it because it's true. You've always handled things." She looked at both of them. "Just don't do it quietly this time." Lena looked at her mother. Then she looked at Patrick. And across the county, at that exact moment, in an office at the Bellow Creek substation that still had the fluorescent light flickering above the front door, an officer's phone screen lit up with an incoming call from a number that the federal monitoring order was already tracking in real time, and the name that appeared on that screen was not a name Ingram had seen before, and she leaned forward in her car to read it, and when she read it her expression did something she almost never let her expression do. She went still. She called her supervisor. "We have a new name," she said. The new name was Warren Fitch. Ingram's supervisor repeated it back to her to confirm spelling, and she confirmed it, and there was a silence on the line that had the quality of two people recalibrating simultaneously. Warren Fitch was not connected to Roy Dunbar directly. He was connected to Dunbar's attorney, a man named Gerald Speaks, who handled the civil side of Dunbar Holdings' legal affairs and had been maneuvering around the edges of Patrick Marsh's courtroom for 8 months, with the particular skill of someone who had learned to work. Jurisdictional seams the way water works cracks in concrete. Speaks was good. He was one of those attorneys who never did anything that looked wrong on its own, but whose composite record, when you laid it out over time, had a shape that was very wrong indeed. Fitch was Speaks' investigator. He was a former county sheriff's deputy who had left law enforcement under circumstances described in his personnel file as a mutual separation, which was the language used when there was something that couldn't be documented but also couldn't be ignored. Since leaving the sheriff's department, he had operated as a private investigator under a license that was current, but that had been flagged twice by the state licensing board for complaints that went nowhere. He was competent in the way that made him useful and careful in the way that made him hard to pin. He was the one who had tracked Patrick Marsh's route. The call that came into Pruitt's phone from Fitch's number lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds, and Ingram's team had it in full because the monitoring order covered incoming as well as outgoing calls. Content was not explicit. It never was with people like Fitch, who spoke in the elliptical shorthand of some unaccustomed to operating in the space between what was said and what was meant. But the meaning was not ambiguous to someone who knew what they were listening for. Fitch wanted to know if the situation was managed. Pruitt told him it was not managed. There was a pause. Then Fitch said, in the flat tone of someone doing arithmetic, that there were people who were going to need a different answer than that by morning, and Pruitt said he understood, and the call ended. Ingram sat in her car for a moment after her supervisor hung up, the phone still in her hand, and the parking lot of the Bellow Creek substation empty around her, except for Reyes's shadow visible through the passenger window of the SUV. She was thinking about sequencing. When you moved in a case like this, the order in which you moved mattered enormously, because each action closed doors that might otherwise stay open, and you had to decide which doors you could afford to close and which ones you needed to walk through first. Fitch was a new variable. He connected the street-level conduct of Pruitt's department to the legal infrastructure around Dunbar Holdings in a way that had been theorized but not documented, and now it was documented, because his number was on Pruitt's phone at 11:47 at night, and the content of that call was preserved in federal custody. She had wanted Speaks for 8 months. She now had a path to Speaks. She got out of the car. Patrick couldn't sleep. He lay on the narrow bed in his mother's spare room, which still had a bookshelf full of the paperbacks he'd left behind when he went to law school, and stared at the ceiling for an hour before giving up and going to the kitchen to sit with a glass of water and think clearly. Courthouse leak was the thing. It was the thing he kept circling back to, not because it was the most immediately actionable problem, which it wasn't. The federal investigation was the most immediately actionable problem, because it was the one that had the most direct reach into his professional life and his ability to continue functioning in the role he had held for 2 years. 4 people had known he and Lena were traveling Route 9 that afternoon. He had been through all 4 of them in his head, not obsessively but systematically, the way he went through case arguments. looking for the weakest link and what it would mean if that link had been compromised. His clerk, Martin Hoyle, had been with him for 18 months. Competent, discreet, professionally reliable in every documented interaction. He lived in Decatur and drove 40 minutes each way and had a family and a mortgage and no visible financial pressure that Patrick had ever observed. None of that was exculpatory. Pressure came in forms that weren't visible until they were, and he knew better than to think he would necessarily see it in advance. His judicial assistant, Diana Rourke, was the second possibility. She had been with the courthouse for 7 years across 2 judges and had a reputation for institutional loyalty. That was the kind of thing people said about someone who had survived enough changes in administration to understand what mattered. She was 61 and retiring in 18 months, and had, from everything Patrick had ever seen, no reason to compromise herself. The third was a security coordinator named Bert Lasky, who had logged the travel advisory Patrick had filed before the trip, a routine courthouse safety protocol that required certain judiciary members to notify security when traveling without detail. Lasky had access to the route information. He also had access to everything else involving court security, which made him either the most dangerous possibility or the least, because compromising a courthouse security coordinator was a significant escalation from leaning on a gas station cashier. The fourth was Patrick himself, and he had not told anyone, which brought him back to the first 3. He sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, when Lena came in wearing her old army surplus shirt and poured herself a glass of water and sat down across from him without saying anything for a minute. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. He looked at his water. "Martin Hoyle." She looked at him. "He's the most likely," Patrick said. "Not because he's disloyal. Because Speaks would have known how to approach someone like him in a way that looked like it wasn't what it was. He's young. He's good. He probably had no idea the chain he was part of when he passed the information." Lena considered this, or he knew exactly. "Yes," Patrick said, "or he knew exactly." They sat with that for a moment. "Ingram will get to him," Lena said. "I know. Patrick stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table, a gesture Lena recognized from childhood, when he was trying to close down an emotion that was getting in the way of the thought. I trusted him with a significant amount. She understood what he was saying. It wasn't about security breach. It was about the specific trust of a judicial clerk, which was one of the more intimate professional relationships in the legal world, a relationship built on discretion and confidence, and the understanding that what passed through that office stayed in that office. "It might not be him," she said. "It might not be," Patrick agreed. He didn't sound convinced. She put her hand over his for a moment, briefly the way you touch someone when there's nothing useful to say. He didn't move his hand. He looked at the table. "Whatever it is," she said, "we handle it." He almost smiled. "Mom said that. Mom's been right about most things." He looked up. For a moment, he looked less like a federal judge, and more like the 12-year-old who had made dinner for her every night for 3 months after their father died, because he had decided that was his job now and he was going to do it well. "Yeah," he said, "she has." The morning came gray and damp, with a kind of low overcast that flattened the Georgia landscape into something resembling itself on a bad day. Lena was up at 6, running the county road east of her mother's house for 4 miles, in the way that she ran when she needed to think rather than when she needed to exercise, which was a different pace and a different posture, and produced a different result. She was thinking about the investigation's timeline and how it interacted with the public visibility of yesterday's footage. Ingram had been clear that the video changed the speed of everything, and Lena understood that to mean both faster in the direction she wanted and faster in the direction she didn't. The counter-narrative would begin this morning if it hadn't already, and it would have a specific shape, because counter-narratives in these situations always did. It would suggest that the stop was procedurally justified, and that the footage was missing context, and that Lena's behavior had been escalatory, which was the preferred framing when the actual footage showed the opposite, because the goal wasn't to disprove the footage, but to create enough ambient uncertainty that casual viewers felt comfortable not forming a firm conclusion. She had been through this once before, not personally, but in an adjacent way, when a soldier in her unit had filed a misconduct complaint against a superior officer, and the response had been a systematic effort to reframe the complaint as a performance issue. She had watched how it worked. She understood the mechanism. The mechanism depended on the target being isolated and unsupported, and unable to produce countervailing evidence quickly enough to establish the narrative before the counter-narrative took root. She was not isolated, she was not unsupported, and the evidence was already in federal hands. She ran the last half-mile at a harder pace than she'd planned, and came back to the house, sweated and clear-headed, and found Ingram's SUV in the driveway. The meeting that morning was in Helen's living room, which Ingram had chosen over any official space, because official spaces created official records of who was present, and she wanted some latitude in how this conversation was documented. Helen had made actual coffee in an actual pot and set cups on the table without being asked, and then removed herself to the back porch with a book, which was the kind of instinctive courtesy that Ingram noticed and appreciated without saying so. There were 5 of them: Ingram, Reyes, Strand, Lena, and Patrick. Strand had come directly from the Merritt station, where she had spent most of the night with Gary Odell, and had emerged with a recorded statement, a cooperative witness, and approximately 2 hours of sleep, which she was managing with the specific determination of someone who knew the work wasn't done. Ingram laid it out. "Here's where we are," she said. "Odell has given us a full statement covering 9 months of coordinated contact with Pruitt. Pattern is documented. Pruitt would enter the store periodically, identify categories of individuals he wanted flagged, and Odell would call it in when those individuals appeared. The triggers were described to Odell as general suspicion, but the specific descriptions Pruitt used tracked the same demographic and contextual profile across all incidents we've already documented." Patrick said, "What was the trigger for yesterday specifically?" "Vehicle type and direction of travel," Ingram said. Pruitt told Odell earlier that morning to call if a pickup, older model, northbound plates, 2 occupants, came through. Lena said he had that before we arrived. "Correct." The description came from Fitch, who had the vehicle information from the route filing. "Which came from the courthouse," Patrick said. "Yes." Ingram looked at him. "We executed a voluntary records request this morning. We have the access log from the court security system. The route filing was accessed at 11:42 a.m. on Friday. I filed it Thursday evening," Patrick said. "The access on Friday was not by you. The room was quiet. Martin Hoyle," Patrick said. "Not a question. His credentials were used," Ingram said carefully. "That's what the log shows. Whether it was him using them or someone who had obtained his credentials is something we're still working through. I don't want you treating it as confirmed until we've spoken with him." Patrick nodded. His face was still in the way it had been since last night. "When do you speak with him?" "This morning," Ingram said. "Strand is going with me." Strand looked up briefly from her coffee. She had the expression of someone who was very tired and entirely functional. Lena said, "What about Fitch?" "We're monitoring. We're not moving on him yet." "Why not?" "Because Fitch leads us to Speaks, and Speaks leads us to Dunbar, and we want all 3 when we move, not just the bottom." Ingram paused. "If we pick up Fitch this morning, Speaks knows in an hour and Dunbar knows in 2, and both of them have the kind of legal resources that make rapid case building significantly more complicated." Lena understood this. She didn't like it, but she understood it. The operational logic was sound. "What do I do?" she said. "You go to work," Ingram said. "You return to Calverton. You complete your shifts. You behave exactly as you would if this were a normal week. Public presence of the case is going to build, and people are going to want to contact you, and you refer everything to the Federal Public Defender's Office contact Patrick established yesterday. And when they try to reframe yesterday's footage." "Let them try," Ingram said. "They don't have anything to reframe it with. Odell's statement, the body cameras, the monitoring record, and Darcy Fowler's video together form a factual record that a counter-narrative cannot dislodge, because it's not a narrative. Documentation." Lena looked at her for a moment. "You've done this before," she said. "Not a question either." 12 times, Ingram said, 11 of which ended with convictions. She paused. "The 12th is still running." Lena drove back to Calverton alone. Patrick stayed with their mother for another day. He needed to speak with his court administrator about the security breach before he appeared anywhere near the federal courthouse, and he needed to do it in a way that didn't signal panic or preemptive conclusion to the wrong people. The drive was 2 hours and 40 minutes, and she drove it with the radio off and the window down 2 inches because she needed the air. The gray overcast had broken into something thinner, not quite sun but not oppressive, and the Georgia highway moved past her in the familiar rhythm of a road she'd driven enough times to stop seeing it consciously. She was thinking about her next shift. She was scheduled for Tuesday, which gave her 1 day, and she was thinking about the specific quality of returning to work after something like this, because she had returned to work before, after things that had happened outside work. And what she knew was that the worst version was when you brought the outside thing in with you and let it contaminate the operational part of your mind, the part that had to be clear in order to do the job without hurting someone. She was not going to let that happen. She thought about the gas station, about Pruitt's expression when he'd put the cuffs on, about the particular contempt of a person who has made a total assessment of another person and gotten it entirely wrong. She was not angry about it in the way that anger consumed energy. She was something more functional than angry. She had a word for it from her deployment days, not a military term, just a personal one. She called it purposeful, which was the state you reached when something unjust had happened, and instead of spending the energy on the injustice itself, you redirected it entirely toward what came next. She was purposeful. She drove. The counter-narrative started at 2 in the afternoon. Came from a local Bellow Creek blog that had about 4,000 regular readers, and the post was headlined with a phrasing that was carefully designed to seem like a question rather than a statement. The post suggested that the footage circulating online was edited, that the encounter had begun before Darcy Fowler started recording, and that Sergeant Pruitt had received a call about suspicious activity that the footage did not show, and that context was essential to understanding the stop. It didn't name a source. It never did. By 4 in the afternoon, the post had been shared by 2 larger outlets that covered regional law enforcement topics, both of which had a history of sympathetic coverage of the Bellow Creek Department that Ingram's file had flagged 18 months earlier. 6. There was a statement attributed to an unnamed spokesperson for the department that described Sergeant Pruitt as a dedicated officer with a strong record of community service and suggested that external parties were attempting to create a false narrative around a routine law enforcement interaction. Ingram read all of it from her car outside an Atlanta parking garage while Reyes went to get coffee. She read it with the same even attention she gave everything, noting what was present and what was absent, because the absence was often more informative than the content. What was absent? Any mention of the cashier, any mention of the vehicle search, any mention of the grounds for detention, any mention of the military service. They didn't know about Odell yet. That meant Odell's statement was still a surprise they were carrying. They didn't know about the monitoring record. They were operating from a partial picture and producing a narrative designed for that partial picture. When Odell's statement entered the public record, the narrative they were building would collapse at its foundation. She thought about timing. She thought about the controlled release of information and the difference between revealing evidence in the service of documentation versus revealing it in the service of spectacle. She had made this mistake once, early in her career, in a case involving a department in rural Alabama, where the evidence had been so strong that she had moved too quickly on too many fronts simultaneously, and the result had been a legal process so complex that it had taken 3 additional years to produce a conviction that should have taken 8 months. She was not going to move too quickly, but she was also aware that the counter-narrative had a clock on it, and the clock ran in one direction, and the longer the alternative framing existed in public, without direct contradiction, the more work it would take to dislodge. She called Strand. "How are we on Hoyle?" Strand exhaled. "He came in voluntarily. He's been talking for 2 hours. And? He didn't do it on purpose," Strand said. "He's not a bad person. He's a 27-year-old who was approached by Fitch under the cover of a background research inquiry, told it was related to a routine judicial review, and asked to confirm scheduling and travel information as part of an administrative verification process." Ingram was quiet for a moment. He believed it. He believed it enough. He's devastated. A pause. He's also fully cooperative and has given us the full chain of the request, dates, methods, language used. Fitch is documented. Good. Ingram looked at the parking garage entrance. Keep him calm. We need him stable enough to testify. Testify, Strand said. He feels responsible. He is responsible, Ingram said, but not in the way he thinks. Get him a commitment from the public defender's office and make sure he understands that cooperation matters. She hung up as Reyes came back with 2 coffees. He handed her one and got in the car. Hoyle, he said. Dupe, she said, genuinely. Fitch is good. Tense? She looked at him over the coffee cup. Past tense. At 9 o'clock that night, Lena was back in Calverton, sitting on the floor of her apartment with her back against the couch, eating cold leftover rice from a container because she hadn't had an appetite until approximately 7 minutes ago, and now she was hungry in the aggressive way that came after extended stress, the body overcompensating for what it had been denied. Her phone had 63 notifications. She had turned them off. She was thinking about something Ingram had said that morning that she kept returning to. The mechanism depended on the target being isolated. She wasn't isolated, and she knew she wasn't, but isolated was a feeling as much as a fact, and the feeling had an edge to it tonight that she was noting with the same clinical attention she gave everything, not feeding it, just noting it. She had called her mother at 7. Helen had answered on the second ring and talked for 20 minutes about the garden and the neighbor's dog and a book she was reading, and at the end of the call said, very simply, that she was proud of Lena, and Lena had said thank you, and they had hung up, and Lena had sat on her kitchen floor for a while after. She opened the container and kept eating. Her work phone rang. She looked at the screen. The number was from within the hospital system, which she recognized as the nurse's station on her regular floor. She answered. "Marsh," she said. "Lena, it's Frank." Frank DeLuca, the charge nurse on the overnight shift, who had worked with her for 2 years and who was one of the more unflappable people she had ever met in a clinical setting. "I'm not calling about scheduling. I saw the thing. Online, and I wanted to, I don't know, I just wanted to call." She was quiet for a moment. "Thanks, Frank. You doing okay?" "I'm eating leftover rice on the floor," she said. So broadly, yes. He made a sound that was a laugh. "Okay, that's actually reassuring." He paused. "You come back Tuesday. Half the floor is going to want to say something to you. Tell them to say it by doing their jobs well," she said. "The version I actually need." "Yeah," he said. "Okay, that I can pass along." They hung up. She sat on the floor and finished the rice and thought about Tuesday. Thought about the department's counter-narrative in Ingram's clock, and Martin Hoyle sitting in a room somewhere explaining how he'd confirmed a travel itinerary to a stranger, because the stranger had used the right official-sounding language, which was a thing that happened and would keep happening, because people extended trust to things that wore the costume of authority. And she knew this, and it still produced something complicated in her chest that she couldn't quite reduce to a single emotion. She was still sitting on the floor at 10:15 when her phone rang again, and the number was Ingram's, and she answered immediately. "Something's happened," Ingram said, "not to you. But it changes tonight's timeline significantly." Lena set down the empty container. "What? Pruitt made a decision about an hour ago," called Roy Dunbar's personal cell phone directly. Ingram's voice was flat and precise. "Not Speaks, not Fitch, Dunbar. And we have the call." Lena was very still. "What did he say?" "He told Dunbar that the woman he'd detained was connected to the federal investigation. She'd been cooperating with agents in the civil rights case. That the whole situation was wider than they'd been told when they sent the route information." A silence. "He didn't know that I knew about the investigation," Lena said. "No," Ingram said, "and now Dunbar does. Which means Speaks will know within the hour, and Fitch will know after that. And we have a window right now, tonight, where we can move before they can coordinate a response." "Are you moving?" "We're moving at midnight," Ingram said. "Fitch, Speaks, and a referral to the Judicial Conduct Board regarding Dunbar's direct interference attempt. Pruitt will be formally served before 6 a.m. Lena looked at nothing in particular. "There's one more thing," Ingram said, and her voice had shifted slightly. Something slightly less operational, something that was almost careful. "Tell me," Lena said. Pruitt's second call tonight was to Officer Marcus Webb. We had it live. Webb didn't respond the way Pruitt expected. A pause. He told Pruitt he was going to speak to the federal investigators voluntarily in the morning. He told him he wasn't going to testify to something that wasn't true. Lena sat with that for a moment. "That's the third officer," she said. "The one who didn't touch the truck." "Dana Croft," Ingram said. "She filed a voluntary contact request with our office 40 minutes ago. Said she wanted to give a statement before the morning." Two of them, Lena thought. Two of the three officers who had been in that parking lot were going to walk into a federal office voluntarily and say what they had seen. The thing Pruitt had built was coming apart at its own edges. "Ingram," she said, "when you move tonight, make it clean." She said it without anger, without triumph, with the flat certainty of someone describing a standard. "Whatever they tried to do, whatever they thought they were doing, make sure when it's documented correctly." "That's exactly what we're going to do," Ingram said. She hung up. Lena sat on the floor of her Calverton apartment and thought about midnight, about federal vehicles moving across a Georgia night to addresses that had been logged and verified and coordinated with enough precision that nobody would have time to warn anyone else. About the specific moment when a mechanism designed to operate in the dark encountered enough light that it couldn't function anymore. She thought about Dale Pruitt and his expression of satisfaction when the cuffs clicked, and what that expression was going to look like at 5:50 in the morning when someone knocked on his door. She set her phone down. She got up off the floor. She went to bed, because she had a 12-hour shift in 40 hours and she was going to need to sleep. And she was going to need to be exactly the same person at Calverton Memorial on Tuesday that she had been every other day she had walked through those doors. Because the work didn't change because of what had happened to her. And the patients didn't know what had happened to her. And the emergency department at 7 in the morning was its own world with its own demands, and she intended to meet them fully. She lay in the dark. She was almost asleep when her phone lit up one more time on the nightstand. She didn't pick it up, but she could see the screen from where she lay, and the text was from Ingram, sent at 11:58. 2 words were moving. And then 60 seconds later, a second text from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be Strand's personal phone, and it said something she wasn't expecting. Webb just told us something about the original call to Odell. There's a name on this we haven't said yet. You need to see it in the morning. Lena stared at the ceiling. She had thought the shape of this thing was almost complete. She had thought she could see its edges. She was wrong. Sleep came and went in shallow stretches, the kind that left her more aware of having slept than actually rested, and by 5:30 Lena had given up and was sitting at her kitchen table with coffee and Strand's text still open on her phone. There's a name on this we haven't said yet. She had not texted back. She had decided, somewhere in the thin hours between midnight and 5 a.m., that she was going to wait for Ingram to call rather than chase the information, because chasing it would not speed anything up and would cost her the specific quality of stillness she needed to maintain right now. She had learned this discipline in the Army, where the hardest skill was not knowing how to act under pressure, but knowing how to wait while pressure built, how to sit with incomplete information and not let the incompleteness drive you into premature action. She drank her coffee. She thought about the shape of what she knew versus the shape of what she didn't know, and she tried to construct the unknown from the edges of the known, which was a habit she'd developed from years of trauma triage, where you never had the full picture before you had to start moving. Webb had told them something about the original call to Odell. Webb was the officer who had searched the truck, who had pulled out the document folio and scattered the papers, who had found the medical kit and looked at it with confused skepticism. She had read him that day as someone operating on borrowed confidence, someone performing the certainty of his sergeant rather than generating his own. When Pruitt had told Webb to build a counter-narrative, Webb had declined. That told her Webb had a threshold, that he was not a true believer in whatever Pruitt was running, just a person who had followed directions until the directions asked for something he couldn't give. The fact that his cooperation had produced a new name meant the name was something Webb had direct knowledge of, not something he'd inferred or guessed. He'd either been present for a conversation, received a communication, or witnessed something that introduced a third party whose name hadn't appeared yet in the investigation's known scope. Turn this over. The known names were Pruitt, Webb, Croft, Odell, Fitch, Speaks, Dunbar, Hoyle, and Martin Dunbar, the LLC director. Every one of them occupied an identifiable position in the mechanism. Pruitt was the instrument. Fitch was the tracker. Speaks was the legal cover. Roy Dunbar was the interest being protected. The others were adjacent, functional, the secondary infrastructure of a scheme that had been running for over a year. A new name meant either a new layer above Dunbar, which would expand the scope significantly, or a new connection laterally, which would add complexity to what was already a dense network. Or it meant something closer to the center of it than any of them had looked. She was still thinking about this when her phone rang at 6:11. It wasn't Ingram, it was Patrick. "You're up," he said. "Hours ago," she said. "You?" "Didn't sleep. I've been reading the monitoring transcripts Ingram shared with my defense counsel." A pause. "There's a name." "I know," she said. "Strand texted me last night." Webb gave it to them. "Did she tell you whose name it is?" "No." Patrick was quiet for a moment that had a texture to it, the texture of someone who has read something and is deciding how to say it. "Terry Voss," he said. "She absorbed this, Terry Voss." The ranking officer at the substation, Pruitt's direct supervisor, the man Pruitt had called in the first 20 minutes after Ingram arrived. She had registered him as institutional infrastructure, the bureaucratic layer above the operational problem. She had not registered him as an active participant. "How deep?" she said. Webb told them Voss was the one who authorized the Odell arrangement, not Pruitt. Voss set it up 8 months ago. Pruitt was running it, but Voss established the protocol and told Pruitt which triggers to use. "He was running it from above," she said. "And he's been on the department's internal review board for the last 4 years," Patrick said. "The same board that buried the original misconduct memo. The thing that had started as a sergeant's decision in a parking lot was deeper than the parking lot by 2 levels at minimum. Voss had built the architecture. Pruitt had operated it. And Voss had been sitting on the oversight body that was supposed to prevent exactly what he was perpetuating. Ingram's team picked him up last night," she said. "This morning with Fitch and Speaks. All 3 within 40 minutes of each other." He paused. Dunbar's attorney not speaks. A different one filed an emergency motion at 7 this morning, attempting to block the monitoring records from entering evidence. It was denied at 7:42. Lena looked at her coffee cup. The small, sequential victories of legal process were satisfying in a way that was entirely different from the large, dramatic ones she had always found. The 7:42 denial was better than the arrest in some ways, because it meant the structure itself was holding, that what Ingram had built was solid enough to survive the first contact with active opposition. "How are you?" she said. "Working," Patrick said. "It's the only useful thing right now." "Yeah," she said. "I know." They hung up. She got dressed, went for a run that was shorter than usual and faster than she intended, came back, showered, and called Ingram at 8:15. "Voss," she said when Ingram answered. "Webb statement is documented and recorded," Ingram said. Voss was taken into custody at 2:14 a.m. He declined to speak without counsel. A pause. "That's his right." "I know that's his right," Lena said. "I'm not asking about the legal procedure. I'm asking whether it changes anything." "It changes the charge structure," Ingram said. "Conspiracy at the department level, rather than individual officer misconduct. It changes the internal affairs scope. It also changes the narrative for anything Pruitt's defense tries to build, because Pruitt can now argue he was acting under direction, which is partially accurate and therefore complicated. Does it change anything for me?" Ingram considered this. "It makes the case more complete, which means it's harder to present you as the problem when the problem is documented across 4 people and 2 levels of authority." She paused. "You're going to be asked to give a formal recorded statement this week. Not today, but this week. Everything you observed at the gas station. Everything you remember from the sequence of events. I want it on record in your own words before anyone else shapes that space. When do you need me?" "Thursday, Atlanta office, 10 a.m. Bring counsel if you want." "I'll be there," Lena said. She went to work on Tuesday. She walked into Calvert Memorial at 6:55 a.m. in her clean scrubs, with her badge clipped at her chest and her hair pulled back, and the emergency department was already running, because it was always already running, and the overnight charge nurse gave her a brief handoff with the particular compressive efficiency of the pre-shift transition. And she listened and noted and took over her assignments and moved into the work. Frank DeLuca, at the end of his night shift, stopped by the nurse's station as he was logging out. "How are you doing?" he said. "Ask me at the end of the shift," she said. "Fair enough," he said and left. She treated a 68-year-old man with a suspected PE who needed immediate anticoagulation and an imaging order, and whose oxygen sat was dropping in a way that required her to move without hesitation. She treated a 17-year-old with a broken wrist from a skateboarding fall who was performing extreme bravado about not being in pain, which she recognized as a coping mechanism, and addressed by being direct about the fracture and asking him focused questions about his pain level that made it easier for him to answer honestly. She treated a woman in her 40s with a presentation that looked like appendicitis and required a surgical consult and a detailed symptom timeline that the woman was having trouble articulating because she was scared, and Lena sat with her while she articulated it, not because she had extra time, but because the timeline was medically necessary, and the woman's fear was getting in the way of the timeline, and the most efficient solution was the human one. This was the work. This was what the work was, and she did it for 12 hours, with the same quality of attention she always brought to it. And at the end of the shift, she sat in the break room with her shoes off, and her feet on the chair opposite her, and drank a cup of tea that tasted like warm cardboard, and felt genuinely like herself. A resident named Tomas Arriaga came in for coffee and stopped when he saw her. "I saw the video," he said. "Most people did," she said. "The way you just stood there." He was searching for the phrasing. "I don't know if I could do that." "You can," she said. "You do it every time you're in a room where someone is dying and you have to stay functional. Same mechanism, different context." He thought about this. "I guess that's right." "It's exactly right," she said. He got his coffee and left, and she sat with her tea and her tired feet and thought about Thursday in Atlanta. The formal statement took 3 hours. Ingram ran it with a second agent named Carla Whitfield, who Lena hadn't met before and who asked most of the questions while Ingram listened and occasionally clarified. It was a detailed, chronological, and precise process, the kind that forced you to distinguish between what you saw and what you inferred and what you concluded, which were 3 different categories of testimony and mattered enormously in terms of what a court could use and how. Lena was good at this. She had learned it in the Army, where after-action reports required exactly this kind of layered accounting, where the difference between the officer appeared to reach for his weapon and the officer reached for his weapon was the difference between an observation and a fact, and you were expected to know which one you were producing. She told them what she'd seen, the cruiser arriving before any call had come in, based on the timing she'd observed between Pruitt entering the store and the call that was allegedly the basis for the stop. She told them what she'd inferred, that the stop was prearranged, based on the specificity of Pruitt's focus and the absence of any actual suspicious behavior on her or Patrick's part. She told them what she'd observed about Gary Odell's expression, and what it suggested without claiming to know what it meant. She told them about the handcuffs and the exact words exchanged, and the position of each person in the parking lot, and the recording that Darcy Fowler had been making. She was careful. She was thorough. She did not editorialize. At the end of the 3 hours, Whitfield thanked her and left the room to file the recording, and Ingram stayed behind and poured them both bad coffee from a carafe that had been sitting too long. You testified like a federal witness, Ingram said. I've done deposition prep, Lena said. Patrick made me practice when I was 26. He said everyone in the family should know how to give a clear account of events. Ingram almost smiled. Smart, he's occasionally insufferable about it, but yes. She held the bad coffee. What happens now? The charge documentation goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office this week, Ingram said. Pruitt Voss Fitch speaks, 4 counts each ranging from conspiracy to civil rights violations to obstruction. Odell accepted a cooperation agreement this morning. His charges are substantially reduced in exchange for testimony. And Dunbar? Ingram set down her coffee. Roy Dunbar is a county commissioner with a significant legal team and 14 months of very careful distance between himself and the operational elements of this. He gave direction through Speaks, who gave direction through Fitch, who gave direction through Voss and Pruitt. The chain is documented in the monitoring records and in Webb's statement, but documentation and conviction are 2 different things. So he walks, Lena said, not necessarily Ingram said, but his timeline is longer and less certain than the others. She paused. The civil trial in Patrick's court is still ongoing, which means Dunbar Holdings still has exposure on the infrastructure fraud case, which means even if the criminal conspiracy charges take longer to land, the underlying fraud case is proceeding. Lena absorbed this. The fraud case. The thing Patrick had been working on for 8 months, the thing that had made them a target, was still moving. Dunbar's attempt to derail it through the gas station had not stopped it, had not even slowed it, had instead produced a parallel federal case that now sat alongside the civil proceedings like an additional weight on the same scale. He made it worse for himself, she said. Considerably, Ingram agreed. The week that followed moved in 2 registers simultaneously, the slow one of institutional process and the fast one of public attention. The public attention had built into something substantial by midweek, driven not by the footage alone, but by the accumulation of details that were now entering the record through legitimate reporting. The monitoring records, once unsealed by the court, produced stories. The charge documentation produced stories. Gary Odell's cooperation agreement produced a story. The story of how a courthouse travel log had been accessed through Martin Hoyle's credentials and fed to a private investigator connected to a defendant's attorney produced the kind of story that people shared. The subject line, this is how it actually works. Darcy Fowler gave one interview, carefully framed through the public defender's office, in which she described what she had seen in the parking lot and why she had started recording. She said she had started recording because something felt wrong, and she couldn't define what specifically. But she had learned over years of watching the world that you trusted that feeling, and you documented things, because documented things mattered, and undocumented things disappeared. Lena did not give interviews. She had been advised against it and agreed with the advice. Statement was in the federal record, and that was where it needed to be, not in a format that could be edited or contextualized or taken out of the order in which it was given. She worked her shifts. She treated patients. She ran in the mornings. She called her mother on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. On Friday, she received a letter forwarded through the federal public defender's office that had been sent to the U.S. Attorney's Office by a woman named Rosalie Perrin, the daughter of Aldous Perrin, the man who had filed the original complaint 2 years ago, that had eventually reached Ingram's desk. The listener said that Rosalie's father had been stopped on Route 9 by Sergeant Pruitt 14 months ago, searched without cause, detained for 40 minutes, and left by the side of the road when nothing was found, and that he had filed a complaint that had gone nowhere, and that he had died of a stroke 6 months later, and that she had watched the video of Lena in the parking lot and cried for an hour because her father had stood in almost exactly the same position against his own car, and nobody had been recording. Lena read the letter twice. She drafted a response through her attorney that was careful and appropriate, and said the right things about the legal process and the importance of Aldous Perrin's original complaint to the investigation, because it was true that his complaint was part of what had put the file in Ingram's hands, and that mattered and should be said. Then she set the letter down and sat for a while. The arraignment for Pruitt and Voss was held in federal court on a Wednesday morning, and Patrick was not present because he was deliberately staying clear of any court proceeding adjacent to his own case to avoid any appearance of influence. He was, however, watching through a connection his defense counsel had arranged, and he described it to Lena that evening in the flat, precise language of someone who had attended many arraignments, and found this one notable, not for its drama, but for its absence of it. Pruitt had entered not guilty, so had Voss. Fitch and Speaks had also entered not guilty, which their attorneys had presumably advised as the default position pending review of the evidence, and which the evidence was going to make difficult to sustain. Speaks looked like a man who had read the monitoring transcripts, Patrick said. Which means he knows how complete it is, Lena said. Yes. His attorney was very quiet in a way that attorneys are quiet when they've advised their client that the tactical situation is worse than the client understood. Fitch? Fitch looked like a man who had done this before, and believed he had done it well enough to survive it. Patrick paused. He's wrong, but he doesn't know that yet. What about Voss? There was a short silence. Voss looked like a man who had spent 22 years building something and watched it come apart in one morning. Lena said nothing. I don't feel sorry for him, Patrick said. But I noted it. Yes, she said. Me too. The piece she hadn't been ready for was Dana Croft. Officer Dana Croft had filed her voluntary contact statement on the night of the arrests and had spent 2 sessions with Ingram's team going through everything she'd witnessed and everything she'd been asked not to report. She had not participated in the search. She had not touched Lena or the truck. She had stood 20 feet away with her arms crossed and her eyes on the pavement because she had been in the department for 3 years and had learned early that there were things you didn't contradict directly if you wanted to keep working. She was 29 years old. She had student loan debt and a younger brother she helped support. She had filed 2 internal complaints in her first year that had gone nowhere and had learned from this, not the wrong lesson, but the survival lesson, which was to stay quiet in specific situations until the staying quiet became its own trap. She had not been willing to lie. That distinction was the one Lena kept returning to because Croft had stayed quiet for 3 years through things she found wrong, and that was not admirable. But Croft had also, at the moment when she was asked to actively falsify her account of what she'd seen, refused. And the refusal had cost her, because she was now in a position that was professionally untenable within the department, and she knew it, and she'd done it anyway. Lena requested, through the public defender's office, a brief meeting with Croft. The meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon in a coffee shop on the edge of Calverton, which was neutral ground and far enough from Bellow Creek that it wasn't going to cause complications. Croft was smaller in person than she'd appeared in the parking lot, or maybe it was just the absence of the uniform, which changed the architecture of a person. She was in jeans and a gray sweatshirt, and she looked tired in the specific way of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. They ordered coffee and sat down, and there was a brief silence where neither of them knew quite how to begin. I'm not here to make any of this harder for you, Lena said. Croft looked at her. I know. I just wanted to... Lena stopped. She wasn't exactly sure what she had wanted. She had wanted to see the person who had stood in the parking lot and not touched anything, and she had wanted to say something to her that was honest. You didn't do anything wrong in the parking lot. That matters. I want you to know it was observed. Croft wrapped both hands around her cup. I did plenty wrong for the 3 years before that, she said. Yeah, Lena said. I know. That doesn't make you feel better. It doesn't make me feel better, Lena agreed. It's the true thing, so it's what I'd rather say. Croft looked at the table. I'm probably done in law enforcement. Probably, Lena said. I'm sorry. Are you, Lena, considered this honestly? I'm sorry that it was the system that burned you, rather than a decision you made at the right time, for the right reason. You made the decision when it counted. It would have been better if you'd had the structure to make it earlier. That's on the system, not just on you. Croft was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You're very calm about all of this. I've had a lot of practice being calm, Lena said. It's not the same thing as not caring. No, Croft said. Can see that. They finished their coffee. They shook hands at the door. Lena drove back to Calverton and didn't think about the meeting for the rest of the day, because she had a shift the next morning and she needed to sleep. But that evening she wrote the gist of the conversation in her journal, Not because she kept a regular journal, but because this was the kind of thing she didn't want to compress into memory without getting it outside her head first. She wrote about Croft, and about Aldous Perrin, and about Martin Hoyle, who was 27 years old and had made a mistake he would carry for a very long time. She wrote about Gary Odell, who had stood at a gas station window, watching the consequences of his own arrangement, and felt something he couldn't name, which she now knew was the correct emotion working correctly in a person who had not yet been entirely flattened by circumstance. She wrote about what it felt like to stand against a truck, with your hands flat on the hood, and know that the most powerful thing you could do in that moment was nothing. She wrote about waiting. The case moved through its procedural stages with the efficiency of a federal investigation that had been built carefully over 2 years, and was now producing results with the structural integrity of something assembled correctly the first time. Odell testified in a preliminary hearing in late October. His account was detailed, corroborated by the monitoring records, and delivered with the plain anguish of someone who understood completely what he had participated in. Preliminary hearing judge found sufficient grounds to proceed on all counts. Bakes entered a plea agreement in November. He gave a detailed account of the instruction chain between Dunbar Holdings and Fitch, documented through communications his own office had generated under the assumption they were protected by attorney-client privilege, an assumption that had not survived the discovery process. Plea agreement required him to testify against Fitch and, more significantly, to document his direct communications with Roy Dunbar regarding the strategy to create a complication in the civil proceedings. Roy Dunbar, through a new legal team, issued a statement denying all allegations. The statement lasted approximately 72 hours before Speake's documented communications made it untenable, at which point a second statement was issued that acknowledged communication with Speake's, but characterized it as routine legal consultation. That statement lasted 48 hours before the monitoring records of Dunbar's direct call to Pruitt rendered it untenable, and a third statement was not issued, because at that point Dunbar's new legal team had apparently advised him that statements were no longer serving any useful function. He negotiated for 2 weeks and did not reach an agreement. He entered a not guilty plea and prepared for trial. His attorney, who was good, began constructing a defense based on the argument that Fitch had been conducting legitimate investigative work on behalf of a legal client, and that the characterization of this work as conspiracy required a degree of intent that the prosecution could not adequately prove. The prosecution had 61 communications between Fitch and Voss that suggested otherwise. Voss, in the third week of November, stopped not speaking. He had been silent since his arrest, and then he was not, and what he said when he spoke produced a second round of charge amendments that added 3 names to the conspiracy documentation, 2 of them county-level officials, and 1 of them a state legislator whose office had, at a specific point 18 months ago, made a call to the county licensing board that had kept Gary Odell's business license from lapsing, which was the original pressure point that had made Odell callable in the first place. When Ingram called Lena with this information, she was sitting in the break room at Calverton Memorial with her lunch. She listened to all of it and then said, "How far up does it go?" "We don't know yet," Ingram said. "Is it going to get there?" Pause. "We're going to keep pulling," Ingram said. Patrick recused himself from the Dunbar Holdings civil proceedings in December. He did it proactively before any motion was filed, on the grounds that his personal involvement in events connected to an active federal case that was directly tied to one of the civil parties created an appearance of conflict that the integrity of the proceedings required him to eliminate. He filed a memo with the court administrator that was careful and complete, and that cited the specific provisions under which recusal was appropriate. He called Lena afterward and told her, and she heard in his voice the specific quality of a man who has made the right decision and knows it, and is also aware of exactly what it cost him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he said. "That's the whole point." She didn't say anything for a moment. "It still gets decided," she said, "a different judge, but the same case, same evidence." "That's correct," he said. "The case doesn't go away. It just continues without me." Dunbar wanted to derail it, she said. And what he actually did, Patrick said, was add a federal conspiracy case, produce a monitoring record that documented his interference in judicial proceedings, burn through 2 law firms, compromise his investigator, implicate a state legislator, and trigger an investigation that is now examining the county licensing board. A pause. The civil case is proceeding on schedule with a new judge who has no connection to anything. Lena sat with this. "That's not what he planned," she said. "No," Patrick said. "It is not." The Thursday before the new year, Ingram sent Lena a brief email with a single attachment. The attachment was a summary document, not for public distribution, of where the various cases stood as of December 31st. She read it at her kitchen table at 7 in the morning with the first cup of coffee of the day and the winter light coming through the window at a low angle. Pruitt charges sustained, trial date set for March. Voss charges sustained, cooperation agreement under negotiation. Fitch charges sustained, trial date set for April. Speaks, plea agreement entered, cooperation ongoing. Odell, cooperation agreement entered, charges substantially reduced. Dunbar, charges filed, December 22nd, 4 counts. Trial date pending. 3 additional individuals, charges filed, referrals to state ethics boards pending. And at the bottom of the document, a single paragraph that Ingram had added in plain language, rather than the formal summary style of the rest. I want to note for the record that the documented conduct of Lena Marsh throughout the events of this investigation, beginning with her behavior during the initial stop on Route 9 and continuing through her formal statement and all subsequent cooperative interactions, was consistent, measured, and materially valuable to the evidentiary record of this case. Her decision to remain calm under provocation rather than escalate, and to document rather than react, contributed directly to the integrity of the evidence we were able to use. That should be stated clearly somewhere, and this is where I'm stating it. Lena read the paragraph twice. She set the document down. She picked up her coffee. Outside the window, the first light of the New Year's last Thursday was making its way across the Calverton rooftops in the flat, specific way that winter light came in Georgia. Not warm, not dramatic, just present, just the day beginning the way days began, without permission or ceremony, without anyone needing it to be more than what it was. She drank her coffee and thought about March. She thought about walking into a federal courtroom and giving testimony, not as a victim and not as a hero and not as any version of herself that had been shaped by someone else's story about who she was, but as a witness, a specific kind of witness, the kind who had been in the room, who had kept their hands flat on a truck hood and their voice level and their eyes open, and who had seen everything. She thought about Aldous Perrin's daughter, who had watched a video and cried for an hour. She thought about what it meant that she was in that video, and he hadn't been, that the same thing had happened to 2 different people in 2 different years on the same road, and only one of them had left a record that the system had to answer. And then she stopped thinking about March, because it was not March yet, and she had a 6 a.m. shift in 2 days, and there was a second cup of coffee in the pot, and the day was beginning. She got up. She poured it. She stood at the window with the cup in both hands and looked at the light, and somewhere set beneath the stillness she carried, beneath the patience and the training and the years of learning to stay functional, when everything around her was designed to produce panic, there was something that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite peace, but was close to both, was the particular feeling of a person who had done the right thing at cost, and was now watching the cost transform into consequence, for someone other than themselves. Not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. Something that felt like the way a fracture heals, not cleanly, not without scar, but solidly, with the specific strength of bone that has been broken and has knit itself back together correctly. She stood at the window until the light shifted. Then she put the cup down, picked up her phone, and saw a text from Ingram that had arrived while she was reading the summary document, sent at 6:54 in the morning, which was early even for Ingram. Voss just agreed to full cooperation. He's giving us the state legislator's direct role in the licensing board call. That's the top of the chain we've been working toward for 2 years. Trial dates are going to move. I'll brief you next week. Also, Darcy Fowler is being invited to testify as a material witness. Her footage is going to be entered as primary evidence. Lena read it. Then a second text, 30 seconds later. One more thing. Webb is cooperating, he asked through his attorney, whether there's a way to speak with you directly before the trial. He said he wants to tell you something. His attorney says it's personal, not legal. Your call entirely. Lena stared at Marcus Webb's name on her phone screen and thought about the moment he had pulled the document folio from behind the seat and set it on the hood of the truck, and the papers had slid across the metal. She thought about what a person might need to say when they had been part of something they should have stopped and hadn't, and how you made room for that without making it easier than it should be, and without making it harder than it needed to be. Type back, tell his attorney yes. She sent it. She set the phone down. And then, at the edge of her field of view, where her apartment wall met the kitchen counter, she saw the medical jacket she'd been wearing that day, the one with the blood stain on the left sleeve, from the patient she'd treated the morning before the drive, hanging on the hook she'd put it on when she got home from Bellow Creek, and hadn't touched since and something settled in her chest that she couldn't quite name. She reached over and took it off the hook and folded it over her arm and went to put it in the laundry because it needed washing, and there was no reason to keep looking at it, and the day was waiting. The laundry ran while she made breakfast, and she ate standing at the counter, and the morning moved through its ordinary sequence, and she let it. Because ordinary was not nothing. Ordinary was the thing worth protecting, the thing that all of it, the gas station, and the handcuffs and the federal proceedings, and the late-night calls from Ingram, had really been about. The right to drive down a highway in an old truck and stop for fuel and go see your mother. That was the thing. That was all of it, reduced to its actual size. She went to work. Marcus Webb came to her in February on a Tuesday afternoon, in the same coffee shop where she had met Dana Croft. He was out of uniform, which she had expected, and he looked younger without it, which she had not. He was 26 years old, and he had the specific quality of a person who had been carrying something at weight for several months and was beginning to feel the physical evidence of it in the way he held his shoulders and the brackets at the corners of his mouth. He sat down. He looked at the table. Then he looked at her. "I want to tell you I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's not what the lawyers on either side would probably want me to say to you. But I've been thinking about it since October, and I can't figure out a way to start this conversation that isn't that." She looked at him steadily. "Okay," she said. "I searched your truck," he said. "I didn't find a reason to search it because there wasn't one. I found your brother's papers, and I put them on the hood, and I didn't—" He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table, and she recognized the gesture from Patrick, that male reflex of physical pressure as emotional management. "I didn't think about who they belonged to. I just did what Pruitt was doing." "You did," she said. "I know," she waited. "The medical kit," he said. "When I saw it, I didn't know what to make of it, because I'd already decided what you were before I opened anything." He looked at her. "Pruitt told me at the station a week before that day that there was a woman, Army medical background, making trouble for the department by cooperating with federal agents. He didn't say your name. He said enough. She absorbed this. He was trying to prime you." "Yes, and it worked." Webb sat back. "Until you asked for his badge number, and I watched his face, and I understood that he was not going to be able to give you a clean answer to that question, and I understood that I was standing in a parking lot, helping someone who knew they were wrong." The room was quiet around them. The afternoon coffee crowd was thin, just a couple of people at laptops near the window. "Why didn't you say something then?" she said. He looked like the question had its own weight. "Because I was scared. Because I had 2 years in the department and Voss was my supervisor, and Pruitt had been on the job for 18 years and I was 26, and I thought—" He stopped again. "I thought the risk was all on my side. It was," she said. "It was on your side and you took it eventually." "Not soon enough." "No," she said, "not soon enough." She held the phrase without softening it, because softening it would be dishonest, and he wasn't here for dishonesty. He was here for the harder version. "But you took it." He looked at the table again. "Is that enough?" She thought about Aldous Perrin. She thought about the 14 months between his complaint and his death, and the 6 months between his death and her arriving at the same gas station, in the same county, on the same road. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think that's a question you're going to be working on for a long time, and the working on it is probably more meaningful than the answer." He nodded slowly. He didn't look relieved. She hadn't tried to make him look relieved. "Your testimony is going to matter," she said. "Not because it makes you a different person than the one who stood in that parking lot, but because it's honest, and honest testimony is what a person owes when they've seen something wrong." Webb looked at her for a moment. "You don't make things easy," he said. "I'm a trauma nurse," she said. "Easy is rarely on the menu." Something shifted in his expression that was almost a smile, and didn't quite make it. Stood up, shook her hand, and left. She sat for a few minutes with her coffee, and watched the afternoon light move across the floor, and thought about what it cost a person to say a true thing to someone they had wronged, knowing the true thing wasn't going to fix it, and choosing to say it anyway. She decided it cost a particular kind of courage that didn't get named very often. She went home. The trial of Dale Pruitt began on a Thursday in March and ran for 11 days. Lena testified on day 4. She wore her work clothes, not her scrub, just clean slacks and a gray blouse. She sat in the witness stand and answered questions with the same quality of attention she had brought to the federal statement in October, the same careful layering of observation and inference and documented fact. Pruitt's defense attorney was competent and tried several angles. He attempted to suggest that the footage was incomplete and missing the context of Lena's initial manner at the pump, which collapsed when Darcy Fowler testified that she had begun recording within 60 seconds of Pruitt exiting his cruiser. He attempted to suggest that Lena's military background and medical training had given her an aggressive professional disposition that had escalated the encounter, which collapsed under cross-examination when the attorney could not identify a single action Lena had taken during the encounter that constituted escalation by any measurable definition. He attempted to suggest that the stop itself was procedurally defensible based on Odell's original call, which collapsed entirely when Odell took the stand and described exactly what Pruitt had told him to say, and when, including the conversation Pruitt had with Odell that same morning, hours before Lena and Patrick arrived. The monitoring records came in clean. The body camera footage from Officer Croft's camera, which had been running throughout the encounter, came in clean. Darcy Fowler's video came in clean. Martin Hoyle's account of the credentials access came in clean. Voss testified under his cooperation agreement for 6 hours over 2 days. He was methodical and specific and visibly diminished, the kind of diminishment that wasn't physical but structural, the way a person looks when the architecture of what they built has come down around them and they are walking through the wreckage, describing where each piece was. He confirmed the Odell protocol, confirmed the trigger parameters, confirmed that the information about Patrick's route had been passed through Fitch's network and reached him before it reached Pruitt, and confirmed that he had been the one to direct Pruitt to make the stop when Odell's call confirmed the vehicle match. He had done all of this, he testified, on the understanding that it served a legitimate purpose of protecting county interests from what he had been told was a politically motivated federal intrusion into local law enforcement. He had been told this by Terry Voss himself, a version of reality constructed by someone who was very good at constructing the realities that other people needed to believe. Webb testified on day 7. He was clear, direct, and showed none of the uncertainty that had characterized his behavior in the parking lot, which Lena noted from the gallery as something earned through the months between the gas station and the courtroom. He described the search. He described what he had found and what he had not found. He described Lena's conduct as calm and non-obstructive throughout the encounter. Described the moment Pruitt put the handcuffs on as unprovoked by anything Lena had done or said. Pruitt's attorney did not push Webb hard on cross, which told Lena that someone had done the math and understood that pushing Webb hard would only produce more of the same in greater detail. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days. The verdict came back on a Friday afternoon, and Lena was at work when it did, because she had a shift and she had decided weeks ago that she was not going to sit in a courthouse waiting room, watching a clock when she could be doing something that mattered. She was in the middle of a patient intake when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She finished the intake. She handed off to the covering resident. She stepped into the corridor and read the text from Ingram. Guilty. All 4 counts. Sentencing in 6 weeks. She stood in the hospital corridor for a moment with her phone in her hand and her badge clipped at her chest, and the sounds of the emergency department around her, the monitors and the movement, and the particular compressed energy of a place that was always in the middle of something. She typed back, "Thank you." She put her phone in her pocket. She went back to work. The sentencing was in late April. Pruitt received 4 years in federal prison and permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification. He would not work in law enforcement again, in Georgia or anywhere else, because the federal record would follow him for the rest of his career, regardless of where he applied. Voss, under his cooperation agreement, received a reduced sentence of 2 years and the same permanent revocation. He had given the prosecutors enough to build the broader case, and they had honored the agreement. Lena did not have a feeling about this that was simple. The reduction was the cost of the information, and the information had been worth more to the larger accountability than a longer sentence for one man would have been. She understood the calculus. Understanding it was not the same as finding it satisfying. Fitch was convicted at trial in April and sentenced to 3 years. His private investigator's license was permanently revoked. Speaks was disbarred in March. His plea agreement produced a sentence of 18 months. He had been a practicing attorney for 22 years. He would not practice again. Roy Dunbar went to trial in June. His legal team was expensive and skilled, and ran a defense that was sophisticated, and argued that Dunbar had been a passive recipient of information rather than an active director of the interference scheme, that he had communicated with his attorneys about his legal situation, as any client had the right to do, and that characterizing that communication as conspiracy required the jury to infer intent from ambiguous language in a way that the law did not support. The prosecution played the recording of Dunbar's direct call to Pruitt. Not Speaks, not Fitch, not Voss. Dunbar's call to Pruitt's personal cell phone, late at night, asking if the situation was managed, The call that Pruitt had received and which had introduced the name Warren Fitch to the monitoring record in the first place. Dunbar's attorney objected to the characterization of the call as directive. Prosecution read the transcript aloud and then read it again, and asked the jury to consider what language specifically in that transcript could be interpreted as anything other than a superior communicating with an instrument of interference about whether an operation had succeeded. The jury deliberated for 1 day. Dunbar was convicted on 2 of 4 counts: conspiracy to obstruct judicial proceedings and conspiracy to deprive civil rights. He was sentenced to 5 years. He was removed from the county commissioners' board by the county ethics panel before sentencing was even handed down. The Dunbar Holdings civil fraud case, now under a different judge, proceeded to its own conclusion in August. The verdict was not criminal, but it was substantial. Dunbar Holdings was found liable for $14 million in fraudulent contract claims and ordered to dissolve its county contract portfolio. 3 county officials who had participated in the contract awards were referred to the state attorney general's office. The state legislator whose office had made the call to the county licensing board about Gary Odell resigned in July, citing personal reasons. The state ethics board investigation was ongoing. Gary Odell closed the Merritt's fuel and supply in September. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. He had been running the station for 11 years, and he had a brother in Savannah who had been asking him to come work in his hardware business for the last 3, and after everything that had happened, statement and the testimony and the cooperation agreement and the long specific shame of having said just to something he should have said no to, he had decided that 11 years in one place was enough, and that the brother in Savannah represented a version of things that didn't have the same weight attached to it. He left the pumps running for the last time on a Thursday afternoon in September and locked the door and sat in his truck in his own parking lot for a while before driving away. He had written a letter to Lena's attorney that fall, which was brief and did not attempt more than it could hold. It said that he was sorry, that he had watched her do something he had not been able to do, which was stand in a position of pressure and refuse to give the person applying the pressure what they wanted, and that he was going to try to be a different version of himself than the one who had made the call, and he didn't expect that to mean anything to her, but he needed to say it. Attorney passed it along. She read it once. She didn't respond. There was nothing dishonest in that. She had no obligation to provide absolution, and he hadn't asked for any. He'd asked to say a true thing. She had let him say it. That was the appropriate exchange. In October, Lena received a letter from the Army Medical Service Corps. Formal and brief. It acknowledged her 6 years of service, her documented performance in rapid response evacuation roles, and her subsequent civilian work in emergency trauma medicine. It noted that her conduct during the events that had become part of the federal civil rights case had been reviewed as part of a broader assessment of how military-trained medical personnel maintained professional standards under non-clinical duress, and that her handling of the situation had been cited internally as an example of applied tactical composure in a civilian context. It was not a medal, it was not a ceremony. It was a letter from an institution saying that it had seen what she did and was willing to put that in writing. She reset it standing at her kitchen counter and then folded it and put it in the drawer where she kept important documents. Next to her discharge papers and her nursing license and a photograph of her and Patrick at their mother's kitchen table taken 2 summers ago. Before any of this, when the table had held coffee and pie and nothing that needed to be resolved, Patrick was reassigned to a new case in November. The administrative process following his recusal had taken longer than expected, which was itself a kind of consequence, because the time a judge spends unassigning and reassigning cases is time not spent on the actual work of the court. He had not complained about this. It was the correct outcome of the correct decision, and he was constitutionally unsuited to complaining about correct outcomes. He called Lena when the new assignment came through. Bankruptcy fraud, he said. 72 counts, 4 defendants, projected trial length of 3 to 4 months. Sounds riveting, she said. It's extremely dry and deeply important, and I'm genuinely looking forward to it. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, its easy fullness. She hadn't expected to laugh on that phone call. You're going to be fine, she said. I've always been fine, he said. The question was whether the system was going to be. And she could hear him thinking on the other end of the line, the particular quality of his silence that meant he was being precise. Better, he said. Not fixed, not clean, better. I'll take it, she said. So will I. The thing that Lena kept returning to, in the months that followed, was not the verdict or the sentencing or the letter from the Army or the case that had eventually run itself to its conclusion across multiple courtrooms and 2 years of federal work. The thing she kept returning to was a much smaller thing. It was the moment in the parking lot of the Merritt station when she had pressed her palms flat against the truck hood and felt the cold metal, and understood that the most powerful thing she could do was be exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was doing, which was nothing that could be used against her, and everything that could be used for her. She thought about what it meant to be calm in a situation designed to produce the opposite. Not the performance of calm, not the mask of it, but the actual thing, the operational state that her training had built, and her years of trauma medicine had reinforced, and her understanding of how power worked had made strategic. She had not been calm because she was unafraid. She had not been calm because she didn't understand the stakes. She had been calm because she knew that her composure was the most accurate record she could produce. That a person who stays still under pressure becomes a mirror, and what the mirror showed in that parking lot was not Lena Marsh being a problem. Dale Pruitt, doing something he was going to spend the next several years answering for. She had not won because she was special. She had not won because the system worked perfectly, because it didn't, because Aldous Perrin had stood in a nearly identical position and filed a complaint that had been buried. And the difference between his outcome and hers was not justice working as it was supposed to, but justice working as it occasionally did, when enough pieces aligned, when a federal investigation was already running, when a woman with a phone was standing at the right pump at the right time, when 2 out of 3 officers turned out to have a threshold they wouldn't cross. That was the true version, not the clean version, not the version where the system identified the problem and corrected itself with appropriate speed, and nobody had to stand against a truck with their wrists locked behind their back first. The version where it was hard and partial and still ongoing in some of its branches, and where the work of the people who had done it correctly, Ingram and Strand and Reyes and Webb and Croft and Fowler, and an exhausted young clerk named Martin Hoyle, who had let himself be deceived and then spent 6 months making it right, had been the actual mechanism of the outcome rather than any single person's courage or any institution's automatic function. She thought about this at the beginning of shifts when she was tying her badge, lanyard, and the day was still unopened. She thought about it when she was with a patient who was scared and needed someone to stay calm so they could borrow the calm. She thought about it when she was running the county road east of her mother's house, and the Georgia morning was doing whatever Georgia mornings did, in whatever season she was in. She thought. The people who dismissed her had handed her the evidence. The people who assumed she was nobody had stood in front of a camera and demonstrated exactly who they were. The people who thought silence was the same as absence had not accounted for the fact that she was listening to everything. You don't have to be loud to be dangerous to an injustice. You don't have to perform strength to have it. You don't have to convince the people who've already decided what you are. You have to outlast them. You have to document them. You have to be the most accurate record in the room, and let the record speak at the volume that records speak, which is not loud, but is permanent. She had spent years training her hands to keep people alive under conditions that were not designed for survival. She had spent years learning to read a room in the time it took most people to cross it. She had spent years understanding that the difference between a person who helps and a person who harms is not intelligence or authority, or the size of the title on their badge. It is what they do with the power they have been given, specifically what they do with it when nobody they respect is watching. Pruitt had not thought anyone was watching. He had been wrong about that in the specific way that people are wrong when they have been correct so many times before that being correct has become an assumption rather than a conclusion. In late November, Lena drove to her mother's house for Thanksgiving. Patrick was already there when she arrived, which meant he had gotten the good chair by the window, which was a point of ongoing low-level contention between them that had existed since childhood and would probably exist until one or both of them no longer had the option of contending over it. "You took the chair," she said when she walked in. "I got here first," he said. "You live closer, that's correct." Helen came out of the kitchen with flour on her hands and looked at both of them and said, without breaking stride, "There are 2 chairs in this house that are equally comfortable, and I am tired of this argument." "It's not an argument," Patrick said. "It's a tradition." "It's both," Lena said. Helen went back to the kitchen. He could hear her laughing. Lena sat in the other chair. It was objectively equally comfortable. She had known this for 30 years. Outside, the November light was the color of weak tea, and the yard was doing what yards did in November in Georgia, which was go the soft brown of things between seasons, not dead and not alive, but somewhere in the patient middle, waiting. Patrick was reading something on his tablet. The room smelled like whatever their mother was making in the kitchen, something with sage and butter that reached back, through all the years of the same smell in the same house, the way certain smells do. "How are you?" Patrick said without looking up from his tablet. "I'm good," she said. "Actually good." He looked up. He assessed her with the particular precision of a brother who had known her since she was 9 years old. "Yeah," he said, "you look it." They sat in the two equally comfortable chairs in their mother's living room, while Helen made Thanksgiving in the kitchen, and the afternoon did what November afternoons do when you let them, which is move slowly and without urgency toward something warm and ordinary, and there was nothing else that needed to happen, and no further accounting to be rendered, and no version of the next hour that required either of them to be anything other than exactly who and where they were. She had been put in handcuffs in a parking lot because someone had looked at her and seen nothing worth accounting for. She had stood flat against a truck hood and been calm, and the calm had been a kind of record, and the record had done what records do when they're complete and honest and preserved correctly, which was outlast the version of events that someone else had tried to put in its place. She had not needed to be extraordinary. She had needed to be precise. She had needed to know the difference between what she could control and what she couldn't, and spend her energy on the first category and her patience on the second, and trust that the distance between what was done to her and what she did in response was the space where the truth would eventually live. It had lived there. It lived there still. Lena Marsh sat in her mother's living room chair in November and listened to the kitchen sounds and felt the ordinary weight of a day with nothing wrong in it, and understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has been through the other version, that this was not a small thing. This was the whole thing, and it had been worth every second of the cost.